In the 8th century BCE, or perhaps earlier, the dating remains contested, a poet we call Homer composed an epic about homecoming. The Odyssey tells the story of a man's 10-year journey back from war through monsters and gods and enchantments to the island kingdom he left behind. We remember Odysseus. We remember the Cyclops, the Sirens, Circe's island, Calypso's cave. We remember cunning and disguise, the bow that only he could string, the slaughter in the hall. We remember less often that while Odysseus was becoming legend, someone else was maintaining the conditions that would allow him to return to anything worth returning to. Her name was Penelope, queen of Ithaca, wife of Odysseus, mother of Telemachus. For 20 years, 10 years of war, 10 years of wandering, she held the title of queen, yet governed a household and, by extension, a kingdom without the uncontested public authority that an absent male king's position would have secured, without the certainty of her husband's survival, without the luxury of knowing whether hope was wisdom or delusion. Homer's epic grants her presence and speech, but not sustained authority over the meaning of her own experience. She appears in the narrative as an object of desire, as a prize to be won, as the patient wife whose fidelity must be tested and proven. She weeps, she dreams, she descends from her chambers. She is described, interpreted, explained. But she is rarely allowed to explain herself on her own terms. The Odyssey is structured around a particular understanding of heroism, one that privileges movement over stillness, adventure over endurance, the journey over the remaining. Odysseus' suffering is cataloged in detail, each monster faced, each temptation resisted, each year of captivity endured. His pain is made epic through narrative. Penelope's suffering is mentioned but not examined. Her 20 years are compressed into a few scenes: the loom, the suitors, the test of the bed. We are told she is faithful, clever, patient. We are not told what faithfulness costs when it must be sustained for 2 decades. We are not told what cleverness means when it must be deployed not in adventure, but in the grinding repetition of daily survival. We are not told what patience becomes when it is indistinguishable from despair. In the social world represented by the Odyssey, the world of elite households in archaic Greece, Penelope occupied an impossible position. Within this aristocratic context, a woman's honor and authority were typically understood through her relationships to men: father, husband, son. The expectations varied by household, by region, and circumstance. But Odysseus' absence created a vacuum of legitimate authority in Ithaca specifically, and the suitors who invaded her household were not merely romantic rivals. They were political threats, consuming her resources, destabilizing her son's inheritance, testing the limits of her power. She could not claim the open, public authority of a king. That role in the poem's world belonged to men. But she could not abdicate either. That would mean surrendering everything Odysseus left behind. So she governed through the forms of authority available to her, what appeared to be domestic labor. She maintained routine. She made decisions framed as household management. She negotiated, delayed, preserved. And she did this alone. Not alone in the sense of physical isolation. The palace was full of people. Alone in the sense that no one could share the weight of her uncertainty. Alone in the sense that she had to be everyone else's certainty while possessing none of her own. No transcript of this lecture survives. No verified record exists of Penelope speaking in her own voice about the nature of her endurance. What remains is what the Homeric text preserves: her actions, her few moments of dialogue, and the testimony and interpretation of others. Telemachus' frustration, the suitor's desire, Odysseus' test, the poet's praise. The reconstruction presented here is interpretive, drawn from close attention to these preserved elements. But if we attend carefully to her actions, to the few moments of dialogue Homer grants her, to the symbolic weight she carries in the narrative and the historical realities of her position, a different testimony emerges. This reconstruction is based upon close reading of the Homeric text, historical scholarship on women's lives in ancient Greece, and the philosophical implications of Penelope's particular form of survival. It imagines what she might have said if granted the narrative authority the epic does not give her. The title of this recovered lecture is On Surviving 20 Years Alone. Playback begins now.
They will tell you I waited. This is the word they use, waited. As though 20 years of my life can be reduced to the passive endurance of absence. As though I stood at the shore each morning, looking toward the horizon, and then returned to my chambers each night. And this constituted the whole of my existence. I did not wait. I governed. I raised a son. I maintained a household that was also a kingdom. I negotiated with men who sought to take what was not theirs. I made decisions that determined whether Ithaca would survive as a coherent entity or dissolve into chaos. I did these things without uncontested public authority, without the certainty of my husband's return, without knowing whether the choices I made were preserving something real or maintaining an illusion. This is not waiting. This is a different kind of heroism, one that your epics do not know how to name. Let me be clear about what I'm describing. Loneliness is not the absence of another person. Loneliness is the discipline of continuing to live when no one can tell you whether hope is wisdom or foolishness. It is the burden of being your own certainty when you possess none. It is the exhaustion of making meaning from routine when the future remains unknowable. Odysseus faced monsters. I faced mornings. Do not misunderstand me. I do not diminish what he endured. The Cyclops was real. Scylla and Charybdis were real. The years on Calypso's island were real suffering, real captivity, real loss. But his suffering had the structure of narrative. Each trial led to the next. Each monster could be faced and defeated or escaped. Each year of captivity had the clarity of imprisonment. He knew he was held against his will, knew what he had lost, knew what he was trying to return to. My suffering had no such structure. I did not know if Odysseus was alive or dead. I did not know if I was a wife or a widow. I did not know if my fidelity was virtue or delusion. I did not know if the household I maintained, the kingdom I preserved, the hope I sustained for my son. I did not know if any of it meant anything at all. And yet I had to continue as though it did. This is what I mean by discipline. Not the discipline of soldiers or athletes, the discipline of repetition when repetition has no guaranteed meaning. The discipline of rising each morning and performing the tasks that maintain a household, maintain a kingdom, maintain the possibility of a future that may not exist. The loom became my ritual. You know this story. How I promised the suitors I would choose one of them when I finished weaving a burial shroud for Odysseus's father. How I wove each day and unraveled my work each night, delaying the choice indefinitely. They tell this story as though it were merely cleverness, a trick, a way to buy time. It was more than that. The loom was the place where I could enact my uncertainty. Each day I wove. This was hope. This was the maintenance of routine. This was the assertion that the future existed and I was preparing for it. Each night I unraveled. This was honesty. This was the acknowledgement that I did not know, could not know, whether what I was building meant anything. Weaving and unweaving. Hope and doubt. Certainty and uncertainty. This was not a trick. This was the most honest representation of my existence I could create. And while I wove and unwove, I raised a son. Telemachus was an infant when Odysseus left. He grew to manhood in a house full of men who were not his father, in a kingdom whose stability was constantly threatened, with a mother who could not tell him with certainty whether his father would return. He needed me to be certain. He needed me to provide hope, to maintain the story that his father was alive, was coming home, that everything we were preserving had meaning and purpose. But I was not certain. This is perhaps the deepest loneliness, to be required to provide certainty for another person when you possess none yourself. To be your child's hope when you do not know if hope is justified. To raise him to believe in his inheritance when you do not know if that inheritance will exist. I could not afford doubt in his presence. I could not afford to let him see my uncertainty. So I performed certainty. I told him stories of his father. I maintained the household as though Odysseus would return tomorrow. I taught Telemachus to understand himself as the son of a hero, the heir to a kingdom, even as I privately wondered whether he was the son of a dead man, whether the kingdom would be taken from him, whether everything I was teaching him was preparation for a future that would never arrive. Motherhood during crisis is its own form of heroism. It requires you to be larger than your own doubt. It requires you to create meaning for another person when you are not certain meaning exists. And then there were the suitors, 108 men, the texts say, though the number varied. They came from Ithaca and the surrounding islands. They filled my hall, consumed my resources, pursued me with a persistence that was both romantic and political. They wanted me, yes, but more than that, they wanted what I represented: access to power, legitimacy, the throne of Ithaca through marriage to its queen. I had no authority to expel them. I was not king. I could not command them to leave. The rules of hospitality, the social structures of our world, meant I had to receive them, feed them, tolerate their presence even as they consumed the wealth of the household and threatened my son's inheritance. So I negotiated. I delayed. I made promises I did not keep. I used every tool available to a woman in my position, which is to say, I used the appearance of compliance to mask resistance. I used domestic authority to enact political decisions. I used the expectations of femininity to create space for governance. This is what I mean when I say I did not wait. Every day was a series of decisions with political consequences. How to manage the household resources so they would last. How to maintain the loyalty of the servants. How to keep the suitors from turning violent. How to preserve Telemachus's claim to the throne. How to maintain my own authority without appearing to claim authority I was not supposed to possess. I was ruling. But because I was a woman, because I was doing it through household management rather than public decree, because I was doing it in the domestic sphere rather than the political one, it was not recognized as rule. This is another form of loneliness: to exercise power that cannot be acknowledged, to make consequential decisions that will never be recorded as such, to govern without public recognition of that governance. Let me make a distinction that matters. There is loneliness, which is a passive state, the condition of being left, of being abandoned, of suffering absence. And there is solitude, which is an active choice, the discipline of remaining with oneself, of continuing without the comfort of certainty, of making meaning in isolation. I did not choose Odysseus's absence. I did not choose the war or the wandering or the 20 years. In that sense, I was lonely. I suffered the condition of being left. But I chose how to inhabit that loneliness. I chose to transform it into solitude, into the disciplined practice of continuing, of maintaining, of governing, of raising my son, of preserving what could be preserved. This choice had a cost. Solitude requires you to be sufficient to yourself. It requires you to find meaning in routine, in discipline, in the daily repetition of tasks that may have no ultimate purpose. It requires you to be your own certainty when the world offers none, and it is exhausting. There were nights, many nights, when I wanted to surrender. when I wanted to choose one of the suitors, not because I desired any of them, but because it would end the uncertainty. It would provide resolution. It would allow me to stop being my own certainty and accept someone else's version of the future. But I did not surrender. Not because I was certain Odysseus would return. I was not certain. But because surrender would mean accepting that the 20 years meant nothing. That the household I maintained, the son I raised, the kingdom I preserved, that all of it was merely waiting, merely the passive endurance of absence, merely the space between Odysseus's departure and whatever came next. I could not accept that, so I continued. Here is what I want you to understand. When Odysseus finally returned, the epic celebrated his homecoming, the recognition, the test of the bed, the slaughter of the suitors, the restoration of order. His journey was complete. His suffering was vindicated. His heroism was confirmed. And I was grateful. I was grateful he was alive. I was grateful the uncertainty was over. I was grateful my son had his father, that the kingdom was secure, that the future I had maintained the possibility of had finally arrived. But something was also lost in that moment. For 20 years I had been the center of my own existence, not by choice, by necessity. I had been forced to be sufficient to myself, to make my own meaning, to govern my own life. I had developed a self that was not defined by relationship to Odysseus, even as I maintained fidelity to him. And when he returned, that self was expected to dissolve. I was expected to return to being wife, to being the object of his story rather than the subject of my own. The epic does not ask what this cost me. It does not ask what it means to spend 20 years becoming autonomous and then be required to surrender that autonomy. It does not ask whether the woman who survived those 20 years was the same woman who said goodbye to Odysseus before the war. I was not the same. How could I be? There are two kinds of endurance in our story. Odysseus endured through movement, through adventure, through the active confrontation of obstacles. His suffering was dramatic. It could be narrated. It had the shape of heroism as your culture understands it. I endured through remaining, through stillness, through the repetition of daily tasks, through the maintenance of routine, through the discipline of continuing when continuation had no guaranteed meaning. His endurance required courage, the courage to face monsters, to resist temptation, to survive captivity, to keep trying to return home. My endurance also required courage, the courage to remain when remaining meant uncertainty, to maintain hope when hope might be delusion, to be everyone else's certainty while possessing none, to govern without uncontested public authority, to make meaning from routine, to raise a son in crisis, to transform loneliness into solitude. But your epics do not recognize this as courage. They recognize the courage of the journey, but not the courage of remaining. They recognize the heroism of adventure, but not the heroism of survival. They recognize the man who leaves and returns, but not the woman who maintains the conditions that make return possible. I am not asking for your pity. I am not asking you to diminish Odysseus's suffering or heroism. I am asking you to recognize that there are different forms of endurance, different forms of courage, different forms of heroism. I am asking you to understand that the 20 years I survived were not merely the space between Odysseus's departure and return. They were my life. They were years of governance, of motherhood, of political negotiation, of philosophical discipline, of the daily practice of continuing when continuation required everything I had. I am asking you to understand that when you reduce those 20 years to waiting, you erase not just my experience, but the very possibility of recognizing survival as its own form of heroism. The courage to remain is equal to the courage to leave. The discipline of continuing is equal to the discipline of adventure. The heroism of survival is equal to the heroism of conquest. This is what I learned in 20 years alone. This is what I want you to remember. Not that I waited, but that I survived.
The Odyssey concludes with reunion and restoration, though not immediately. In Book 23, Odysseus reveals himself to Penelope, slaughters the suitors, and reclaims his throne. Penelope tests him with the trick of the bed. Only Odysseus would know that it was built around a living olive tree, immovable. He passes the test. They retire to their chamber. Homer gives us a scene between them in which Odysseus tells Penelope about his journeys, the Lotus Eaters, the Cyclops, Circe, the underworld, the Sirens, Scylla and Charybdis, Calypso's island. He narrates his suffering. She listens. The poem tells us that she is moved by his account, that she weeps at his trials. But the poem gives us little sense of what Penelope recounts in return. We don't hear her narrate the 20 years in comparable detail. We do not learn whether Odysseus asks for her account, whether he understands that her survival was its own form of Odyssey. The text is largely silent on this exchange. Book 24 continues beyond their reunion. It moves outward to the suitor's descent to the underworld, to Odysseus's visit to his aging father Laertes, to the threat of renewed violence as the suitor's families seek revenge. Only when Athena intervenes to establish peace does the poem finally conclude. Throughout these final scenes, Penelope's voice recedes further. She is present but not consulted on the most consequential decisions. She is affected but not asked. The poem does not tell us what she thought about the execution of the enslaved women, whether she had authority to prevent it, whether their deaths troubled her. It doesn't ask whether she believed the peace Athena imposed would hold or what she imagined for Ithaca's future now that Odysseus had returned. We are not told what Penelope said. We are not told what she thought. The text is silent on this. Later traditions fill this silence in various ways, none of them entirely satisfying. Some versions emphasize Penelope's fidelity, making her the model of the patient wife, the woman who waits without complaint, whose virtue is defined entirely by her relationship to her husband. These interpretations reduce her to symbol. She becomes the embodiment of wifely devotion rather than a person with her own interior life, her own suffering, her own form of heroism. Some later ancient traditions question Penelope's fidelity during those 20 years, imagining that she had relations with one or more of the suitors, or even that she deceived Odysseus himself. These versions grant her more agency, but often in service of diminishing her, making her suspect, her virtue questionable, making her the problem to be solved rather than the person to be understood. In many medieval and Renaissance adaptations, Penelope was sentimentalized. She became an ideal of patient femininity, the woman who suffers beautifully, whose pain is made aesthetic rather than fully human. Paintings show her at the loom, gazing wistfully toward the sea, frozen in the posture of waiting. These images are lovely. They're also reductive. From the 19th century onward, and especially in feminist scholarship and contemporary retellings, some interpreters have recovered Penelope as a political figure, recognizing that her management of the household during Odysseus's absence was a form of governance, that her negotiations with the suitors were political acts, that her survival required intelligence and strategy equal to anything Odysseus deployed on his journey. Contemporary retellings, novels, plays, poems have given Penelope her own voice, allowed her to narrate her own experience, and challenged the epic's distribution of narrative authority. Margaret Atwood's The Penelopiad imagines Penelope speaking from the underworld, offering a counter-narrative to Homer's epic. Other works have explored her relationship with the enslaved women who were hanged after the suitor slaughter, the political complexities of her position, and the psychological cost of her endurance. But even these recoveries face a fundamental challenge. Penelope exists in our imagination primarily through Homer's text. We cannot fully separate her from the narrative that created her. We can't know with certainty what she would have said if granted the authority to speak for herself. What we can do is attend carefully to what the text reveals despite itself, to the moments when Penelope's actions suggest an interior life more complex than the epic acknowledges, to the political realities of her position that the narrative treats as merely domestic, and the philosophical implications of her particular form of survival. The reconstructed lecture you just heard emerges from this careful attention. It isn't an invention, but an interpretation, an attempt to articulate what Penelope's actions and position suggest about her understanding of her own experience. The central insight of this reconstruction is that loneliness, as Penelope experienced it, was not a passive state, but an active discipline. That her 20 years were not merely waiting, but a different form of heroism, one that required the courage to remain, to continue, to maintain meaning through routine when the future was unknowable. This insight matters because it challenges how we understand heroism itself. The Odyssey, like most epics, privileges movement over stillness, adventure over endurance, the journey over the remaining. It recognizes the courage required to leave, but not the courage required to stay. It narrates Odysseus' suffering in detail, but compresses Penelope's into a few scenes. This distribution of narrative attention reflects deeper assumptions about whose experience counts as significant, whose suffering deserves to be examined, and whose form of courage deserves to be recognized as heroism. Penelope's reconstructed testimony challenges these assumptions. It insists that survival is its own form of heroism, that the discipline of continuing when continuation has no guaranteed meaning requires courage equal to any adventure, that the burden of being everyone else's certainty while possessing none is its own form of suffering worthy of recognition and examination. There is a moment near the end of the Odyssey that has always troubled me. After Odysseus slaughters the suitors, he orders Telemachus to punish the enslaved women accused of having sexual relations with them. Telemachus commands them to remove the bodies from the hall and clean the blood. Then he has them hanged. Penelope is not present for this. She's upstairs sleeping. Athena has put her into a deep sleep so she will not witness the violence. When she wakes, the hall is clean, the suitors are dead, and order is restored. The text doesn't tell us what Penelope thought about the women's execution. It doesn't tell us whether she knew them, whether she had governed them during the 20 years, and whether their deaths troubled her. It doesn't ask whether she possessed the authority to prevent their execution, or whether she would have if she could. The poem doesn't examine the circumstances of these women, whether their relationships with the suitors were chosen or coerced, whether they had any agency in the matter, and what their own survival meant or cost. Their deaths are represented as justice, but Penelope's perspective on this justice is never sought. This silence is characteristic of how the epic treats Penelope. She is present but not consulted. She is affected but not asked. She is part of the household but not granted authority over its most consequential decisions. The reconstructed lecture cannot answer these questions, but it can insist that they matter. It can insist that Penelope's 20 years of governance, of survival, of maintaining the household and kingdom should grant her voice in what happens next. In the end, what survives of Penelope is not her own testimony, but others' interpretation. The patient wife, the clever woman, the faithful queen, the political survivor, the symbol of feminine virtue, the problem to be solved. All of these interpretations contain some truth. None of them is complete. What the reconstructed lecture offers is not a definitive answer, but a different question. Not who was Penelope, but what would Penelope say about who she was? Not what did she do during those 20 years, but what did those 20 years mean to her? Not was she heroic, but what form did her heroism take, and why has it been so difficult for us to recognize? The courage to remain is equal to the courage to leave. This is the central insight of Penelope's testimony, and it remains relevant precisely because we still struggle to recognize it. We still privilege movement over stillness, adventure over endurance, the dramatic over the daily. We still find it easier to narrate the journey than the remaining, to recognize the heroism of conquest than the heroism of survival. Penelope's voice, recovered from the silences of Homer's text, insists that we expand our understanding of what counts as heroism, what counts as courage, and what counts as a life worth examining and honoring. She didn't wait. She survived. And survival, sustained over 20 years without certainty, without uncontested public authority or recognition, without the comfort of knowing whether hope was wisdom or delusion, that survival was its own Odyssey, its own epic, its own form of heroism. Even if the epic that bears her husband's name could not recognize it as such. Ghost Lectures Voices from Classic Literature is written and narrated by Danielle Christmas and produced by Audio Ellis. If you enjoyed this lecture, consider subscribing and sharing the recording with another reader of classical literature. Additional lectures will be released as new materials are recovered.